You're listening to the Men's Podcast from PursueGOD.org.
Hello, men, and welcome back to the podcast. This is Pastor John, and today we're in our second episode of our Failure to Lead series. In this series, we are trying to glean information from biblical leaders and some of their failures so that hopefully you and I don't repeat the same mistakes that they did. Last time we kicked it off by looking at Adam, and we saw his passivity. We saw that he tried to hide from responsibility and that he tried to blame shift. I'm sure there are some other things we could have pulled out of that story, but those are the three main points. Today we're looking at King Saul. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, he's an obvious choice for this series. He was such a horrible leader that God ripped the kingdom away from him and gave it to David. And that's true. That is what happened. That's how it's ended. But Saul wasn't always a horrible leader. We actually see glimpses of him doing the right thing and making some good decisions early in his reign. And that's because God had changed his heart. 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 9 says, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart. And all these things happened that day. Now, leading up to that, Saul had gone on a mission to find his father's donkeys who had gotten lost. And on that mission, God revealed to the prophet Samuel that he was going to meet Saul and that God had called Saul to be king. Now, I won't get into all the background of what happened. You can read that for yourself in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and chapter 10, and I would encourage you to read through that when you have some time. Things started out really well for Saul. Saul was a head taller than any other Israelite. It said that you couldn't find a more handsome guy. So you would think it would be really easy for Saul to be arrogant, for Saul to be prideful, and I think that is where he ends up. But here where God changes his heart, we actually see evidence that he was humble. In fact, after one of Saul's first big victories, I'll read from 1 Samuel chapter 10, but some people who wanted to stir up trouble said, how can this fellow save us? They looked down on him. They didn't bring him any gifts, but Saul kept quiet about it. Now, that's right after Saul was proclaimed to be the king, but it was actually before his first big victory. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 11, we see that Saul brings the Israelites a victory. And then in verses 12 and 13, it says, the people said to Samuel, who asked, is Saul going to rule over us? Turn these men over to us. We'll put them to death. But Saul said, no one will be put to death today. After all, this is the day the Lord has rescued Israel. So again, what had happened is these detractors had said, how can this guy serve us? How can he be our king? And they didn't bring him any gifts. But it says Saul kept quiet about it. Saul could have made a fuss right then and there. And then again, after this big victory, many of the other people said, hey, let's get those troublemakers, let's get those detractors, and let's put them to death. And Saul said, no one's going to be put to death today. After all, this is the day the Lord has rescued Israel. I love how Saul acknowledged that God is the one who actually rescued Israel. Saul was just a tool that the Lord used. Saul could have gotten swept up in the emotions. In fact, we'll see that becomes a pattern in his life later. He could have been prideful and said, how dare these men question my right to be king when God himself called me and Samuel anointed me. But Saul started out humble and obedient. And again, I would say all the credit, all the glory goes to God for that because God is the one who changed his heart. But I think that's a good reminder to us, men. It's not how we start, it's how we finish. We need to stay alert. We need to continuously ask God to keep our hearts soft because we don't want to be a leader like Saul who starts out well, but then makes these mistakes that we're going to start looking at. And one of the first things I noticed that Saul allowed himself to do is he got into this pattern of making rash decisions when his emotions were high. You and I as men, you and I as leaders should always be aware of how our emotions can impact our decision-making. Taking some time to calm down before making important decisions is almost always wise. One of the first times we see Saul allow his emotions to push him into a rash decision is in 1 Samuel chapter 14. I'm going to read beginning in verse 24, and then I'll give you some context as to what's happening. It says, "The Israelites became very hungry that day. That's because Saul had forced the army to make a promise. He had said, 'None of you must eat any food before evening comes. You must not eat until I've paid my enemies back for what they did. If you do, may you be under a curse.' So none of the troops ate any food at all. The whole army entered the woods. There was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey dripping out of a honeycomb. No one put any of the honey in his mouth. They were afraid of the curse that would come if they broke their promise. But Jonathan," that's Saul's son, "hadn't heard that his father had forced the army to make a promise. Jonathan had a long stick in his hand. He reached out and dipped the end of it into the honeycomb. He put some honey in his mouth, and it gave him new life. Then one of the soldiers told him, 'Your father forced the army to make a promise that everyone must obey. He said, "None of you must eat any food today. If you do, may you be under a curse." That's why the men are weak and ready to faint.' And Jonathan said, 'My father has made trouble for the country. See how I gained new life after I tasted a little of this honey? Our soldiers took food from the enemies today. Suppose they had eaten some of it. How much better off would they have been? Even more Philistines would have been killed." So to set the context for what has happened, this is following up on the story where Jonathan and his armor bearer climb the cliffs and begin to rout the Philistines, and it sends them into confusion. So the Israelite army jumps into the fray, and they're chasing the Philistines. They're mopping them up. They're wiping them out. And Saul, out of vengeance, puts this crazy command on the army that they can't eat any food. He makes this rash decision, and it's a decision that doesn't just affect him. I mean, obviously it's a decision that affects all of his army that day. Jonathan isn't aware of the promise that the army had to make, and so Jonathan eats this honey. The other soldier says, "No, your dad put us under a curse. We're not allowed to eat anything today." And Jonathan recognizes the foolishness of the command. Jonathan said in verse 29, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how I gained new life after I tasted just a little of this honey. And if our soldiers would have eaten today, imagine how many more Philistines would have been killed." And obviously the context that you and I might find ourselves in is a little different than that, but I would imagine each and every one of us can think of a time when we made a foolish decision because we were really emotional when we made it. I know that there have been times when the way I disciplined my children was not wise because I did it when I was still really angry for what they had done or for the way that they had disobeyed me. I know that there have been times, even in ministry, when I have made decisions out of frustration. I've made decisions out of anxiety. I know when I first went into ministry, I had several key leaders that had stepped away, and I felt the anxiety of replacing those leaders, and I replaced them too quickly. I put the wrong people in the roles at our local church because I was scared. I wasn't trusting God and His provision. I wasn't allowing time for me to really think through who would be the right people to ask to serve in those roles. And here's the issue. Here's the reality of those situations. At the end of the day, they cause us more frustration. So those individuals that I asked to serve in those roles didn't serve in those roles very long, and then either stepped away themselves or I had to ask them to step down because it just wasn't a good fit. So when you're in the midst of something that you can tell is really getting your emotions going, again, whether that's anger, whether that is frustration, whether that is fear and anxiety, I just would encourage you, don't make any rash decisions. Give yourself some time. Ask God to help you calm down. Ask God to give you a clear head. Go to Him for wisdom, because those rash decisions don't just affect us, they also affect those that we lead. And this isn't the only time we see Saul do this in his time as king. We're going to see it several more times. But let's go ahead and focus on another one of the major mistakes that we see come up in Saul's life. Saul forgot that he was a man under authority. Saul began to believe that he was above the rules. And the reality is that those that we lead should be able to look at us and see men who regularly submit to authority. Obviously, ultimately, that's God's authority, but even in the secular world, unless you are the CEO, you likely have someone who's in a position of authority over you. And then if you are in a position of authority over others, how do they see you respond to direction from those above you? Do they see you always push back? Do they see you always gripe and complain? Or do they see you as someone who has learned how to submit to authority? In 1 Samuel 13, verse 7, we read that Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were shaking with fear. He waited 7 days just as Samuel had told him to. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So we can tell that he had received clear direction from Samuel to wait. So Samuel had told him to wait until Samuel arrived, and then we see that Samuel is running late. Verse 9, it says, "So he said, 'Bring me the burnt offering and the friendship offerings.' Then he offered up the burnt offering. Just as Saul finished offering the sacrifice, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to greet him. 'What have you done?' asked Samuel. Saul replied, 'I saw that the men were scattering. I saw that the Philistines were gathering together at Michmash. You didn't come when you said you would. So I thought, now the Philistines will come down to attack me at Gilgal, and I haven't asked the Lord for his blessing. So I felt I had to sacrifice the burnt offering.' 'You have done a foolish thing,' Samuel said. 'You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command.'" Now, our first inclination may be to read that story and go, what's the big deal? I can see why Saul didn't wait because Samuel didn't show up when he said he would. But God had commanded the nation of Israel that only the Levite tribe, only the priests could offer the burnt offerings. And so it wasn't just Samuel's directive to wait. Saul was going against what God had commanded. In fact, Samuel reminds him of that. Samuel says in verse 13, "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time." We just talked a couple of minutes ago about how Saul allowed his emotions to make rash decisions, and we see that again in this situation. Saul got scared. He was afraid the Philistines would come down and attack. He let that panic of that happening and the men leaving overwhelm him, and he made a rash decision to sacrifice the burnt offerings. Is there something in your life where God has called you to be obedient and you're not doing it? Do you sometimes feel like you are above the rules? So if you're in the corporate setting and you're asking people who are underneath you to adhere to certain policies or certain guidelines, do you sometimes feel like you're above that because you've put your time in? You've sacrificed for the company, and so you don't need to do those things. I think we need to take an honest assessment as to how obedient we are so that we can model that for those that we lead. Now, this is just the beginning of Saul's disobedience. Let's look at another story. This example comes from 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we're going to begin in verse 1. We're going to read 1 through 3. Then we're going to jump ahead to later in the story, so we won't read the full chapter, but you guys can read that when you have some time. It says, "Samuel said to Saul, 'I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys.'" We're going to jump forward now to about verse 7. "Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. Now, I just want you to think about that for a second. I think Saul already knew Samuel was coming to call him on the carpet for being disobedient, and he's going to try and get the jump on the situation, right? He's going to try and act like I've done what the Lord asked me to do. In fact, we'll see that throughout this interaction. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? In other words, if you fully obeyed the Lord's instructions, I wouldn't hear these animals because you would have killed them all like you were supposed to. Verse 15, Saul answered, The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Notice he says the Lord your God and not the Lord our God. Man, how heartbreaking is that? This change of heart that God had given Saul, we see that Saul is now not even saying, our God, he's saying the Lord your God to Samuel. Samuel replies in verse 16, Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So Saul not only disobeys, he still wants to argue about it. He wants to justify what he did. And it's just a good reminder to me that partial obedience is disobedience. I know when our kids were little and we were trying to teach them the idea of obedience, that complete obedience meant that you did it right away and with the right attitude. Complete obedience is I'm going to do everything God has called me to do, and I'm going to do it when he calls me to do it. So men, in whatever roles you find yourself leading, if it's just in the home, because we all lead in the home, if it's in your local church, if it's at work, we need to submit to authority. We need to be obedient. Particularly, we need to be obedient to God's laws, to God's call in our life. That's how he's going to continue to bless us as we lead others. The last thing that I hope we'll learn from in the story of Saul is that jealousy and insecurity will cripple you as a leader. Good leaders recognize it's not just about them, that the goals of the organization, whether that's the company, whether that's your local church family, are more important than me as an individual. And because of that, good leaders raise up those underneath them and empower them. Part of being a great leader is identifying the talents and the giftings of those under you in your organization, and then encouraging them to develop those giftings for the good of the organization. That means even if those individuals eventually get more notoriety, more accolades, more credit than you. Now, you have to be secure in who you are to be able to do that. If you have insecurity, if you're always afraid that, someone's going to find out that I'm not as good as so-and-so, or that this is my weakness, that will cripple you as a leader. And we see that start to happen in Saul's life shortly after David defeats Goliath. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 8. It says, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, they're talking about Goliath there, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul. and was singing and dancing with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. You can just hear and feel the insecurity Saul has as a leader. He figures there's nothing else David can take from me except the kingdom. They've elevated David. They're saying that he has killed his tens of thousands. I've only killed thousands. The obvious next step is he's going to take the kingdom away from me. How quick are you to elevate and empower those that you lead? Do you feel like one of your giftings is being able to identify the gifts and talents of those that you're leading, of those that you're caring for? You know, I coached football for many years, and I tell people all the time, I am not a great X's and O's guy, which may make you laugh. You probably think, well, then why were you a coach? But I just really was not a great in-game coach. I wasn't great at making adjustments. I wasn't great in making kind of those quick decisions. Where I felt like my strength lied was in identifying the giftings and the talents of the kids I coach. I think I was really good at putting kids in a position where they could succeed. And so I think that's helped me as a leader in ministry. I don't get it right all the time, for sure. There's times when I've put the wrong people in roles. But as I mentioned earlier, that's usually because I let emotions dictate the decisions. It's because I was making rash decisions, because I was feeling fear or feeling anxiety. But when I allow God to just, give me peace and give me a sense of calm when I am not making decisions in the heat of the moment, I think one of the giftings God has given me is the ability to see where people would be a good fit and where they'd be able to use their giftings the most. And I think that's really helped me as a leader. I hope that would be one of your goals as a leader, that you would really desire to raise up and equip the people that you're leading. And that doesn't have to just mean in the workforce or in the secular world. What are the gifts your children have? Have you really thought about where God has gifted your children or your wife? And if so, have you communicated that to them? I tell my wife all the time, she has the gift of compassion. She truly does. It's a spiritual gift she has. She's more than just, a compassionate person. She has compassion that goes above and beyond anyone almost I've ever met. And so for me to recognize that and then encourage her to use that, encourage her to put herself in situations where she gets to share that compassion on others. My oldest son, from the time he was young, I could just tell had this strong sense of justice about him. He thought that it was important that things were right, that things were fair. And so it's no surprise to me, although he never talked about law enforcement growing up, it's actually not a surprise to me at all that he's currently in law enforcement for his profession because of this sense of justice that he has, because of this sense of fairness, and that the rules should apply to everyone. So I want you to think about that. Dads, when's the last time you really took some time and asked yourself, what are the gifts, what are the strengths that my children have? If you haven't done that in a while, I want to encourage you to do that. And then once you feel like you have a handle on what those gifts are, I would encourage you to share those with your children. I would encourage you to build them up and say, look, son, or look, my daughter, these are the things I see in you. These are talents and gifts that I believe God has given you. I think they'll love that encouragement from you. We can do that for our wives as well. And if you are a part of the local church, if you have a leadership position in the church, are there individuals in your church that maybe aren't serving right now or aren't really engaged, that you could come along beside them and you could recognize the giftings they have and that you could empower them? You could encourage them to take on responsibility. Now, you have to be secure in who you are. You have to be comfortable in your own identity, and you have to know that it's not all about you. And I'll just confess that can be tough for any leader. That can be tough for a pastor. I'm the campus pastor at my campus. So in some churches, they would call that the senior pastor. And there is definitely a temptation to want to make it about me sometimes. There is a temptation to not want to really empower or equip someone, because what if they can do it better than me? And God's still working in my heart on that. I'd love to tell you that I have it totally whipped, that I'm totally secure, but there's still times I battle that. I'm definitely growing in that area. I think God has really given me a lot of freedom in that area, that, hey, this is not about me. God is using a broken guy like me, and he can use any other broken guy. And I should just be thankful and grateful that in this season, he's using me the way he's using me. But my heart should always be to raise up and equip and develop the next leaders. I'm no spring chicken. I'm in my 50s, and I don't know how much more time I'm going to be in vocational ministry. I hope it's for at least another 15 to 20 years, but I don't know God's plan. And so am I being intentional about raising up the next generation? Am I equipping and empowering them? And am I okay if they kind of take the spotlight, so to speak? Now, hopefully the ultimate spotlight at our church is always going to be on Jesus Christ. But I think you know what I mean. We all have this tendency to want the approval of men, to want the accolades. I'm not immune to that. You're not immune to that. But good leaders are not crippled with insecurity and jealousy. We rejoice in the gifts of those that God has put around us. So those are some lessons that I think we can learn from Saul as a leader. I hope that we will avoid some of the mistakes that he made. On our next episode, we're going to look at the life of David. And you probably think we're going to go straight to the David and Bathsheba story. That will be part of it. But there are actually other issues in David's life where I believe he failed to lead, and I think we can learn from those. So I hope you have this conversation with another man in your life, with your son, and I hope that God continues to encourage us as we seek to be better leaders.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please consider rating our podcast. It's a simple way to help us reach more people. Find more resources to talk about these topics with your small group, family, or mentor on PursueGOD.org.